I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the 92nd episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. It's right before Christmas. We have 7 shopping days, so get to those small independent bookstores. Do your Christmas shopping there this year. They'd appreciate it, and so would the authors. Today, we are going to have a discussion with Ellison Cooper, who wrote the book Buried.
Ellison Cooper has a PhD in anthropology from UCLA with a background in archaeology, cultural neuroscience, ancient religion, colonialism, and human rights. She has conducted field work in Central America, West Africa, Micronesia, and Western Europe. She has worked as a murder investigator in Washington, D.C., and is a certified canine search and rescue federal disaster worker. Ellison now lives in the Bay Area with her husband and son.
In Buried, Senior Specialist Sayer Altair studies the minds of psychopaths, but even she didn't expect to uncover a killer within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Rooting him out and exposing internal corruption got her a bullet wound and 6 months of desk duty. Now she's finally back in the field, called in when an off-duty FBI agent and his cadaver dog fall into a sinkhole filled with human bones. Found deep in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, the skeletal remains date back almost 2 decades, the same time a beloved local teen disappeared. The local case quickly heats up when Sayer's team finds 2 fresh corpses among the bones. When a gruesome clue ties these new bodies to a woman recently kidnapped along with her young daughter, Sayer has to uncover the connection between the old bones and the new bodies before the mother and child become the next victim. Welcome, Ellison.
We would like to welcome Ellison Cooper, who is the author of the book Buried. Welcome, Ellison.
Thank you for having me.
Your previous profession was anthropology, where you conducted field work in various exotic locations around the world. Are you writing full-time now? If so, do you miss your more adventurous career?
I'm writing full-time now. Occasionally, I do miss my sort of adventurous days. There were definitely a few times later on in my academic career where I was living in a hut in the jungle and caught the latest tropical disease was going around that I questioned my choices. And so it was fine when I was in my 20s, living in a tent with no electricity or running water for many, many months. Now that I'm a little older and I have a son, I'm actually quite content to be writing full time now.
Another previous occupation was as a murder investigator for the Washington, D.C. Public Defender's Office. Will any of those experiences show up in your books?
So a lot of the experiences I had in general definitely show up in all of those books. I think my time there really gave me a sort of insider's view of the functioning of the criminal justice system. And I think sort of seeing those pieces and how they all fit together and how a real murder investigation is conducted are all in my Sayer Altair books. To be honest, most real murder investigation is just boring. It's just a lot of waiting around and a lot of time looking at documents or even going and mapping out the crime scene, which can sound sort of romantic until you're actually doing it for the 20th time. So the actual details of any case, certainly I wouldn't use any real cases that I worked on. I think that's probably too sensitive. Even the actual realities of murder investigation only loosely make it in because real murder investigations are basically, I would say 95% very, very boring detail work and then punctuated by maybe 5% moments of sheer terror.
Well, I have to say, I think that one thing that comes across in the book is how much you care about some of these characters. I think that your years working with this office has given you an insight of what these people go through.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people are willing to sort of romanticize murder investigations. We had a few months of training, and the first few months I did just training. And then my first outing, actually, as an investigator, I was assigned to, it was me and my partner, and we were just taking witness statements from drive-by shooting. We were interviewing a woman who had actually witnessed the shooting, and she had a little girl there with her. My partner and I didn't really want this little 2-year-old girl sitting there with her mom while we're talking about the details of this murder. So I decided, okay, well, why don't I take the little girl in the other room and I'll just sort of entertain her while you get the statement from the mom. And it was only after we finished getting that statement that I realized that the little girl had actually been there and witnessed it herself. And then I found out even later that it was her father that was shot in front of her.
Oh, dear.
The horror of all of that really carried through in all of my investigations. And I mean, it was almost all gang-related shootings. Even those kinds of murders, the sort of toll it took on all of the people, the victim and the victim's family, but also the witnesses, and then also the police and the prosecutor and the defense, everybody involved, even though they're somewhat inured to it after a while, it's heartbreaking and just sort of gut-wrenching. And I really wanted to sort of express that in my writing.
Definitely did.
Thank you.
There are some controversy now about the overabundance of violence against females in crime fiction, despite the fact that 70 to 80% of the victims in real life are male. Why did you choose to make your victims female?
That is the best question, by the way. I think that's a really interesting controversy. I'm a strident feminist and have thought very, very much about this question. Why do I love crime fiction? And why do I love especially reading these kinds of books and now writing these kinds of books with female victims? And I actually think it's pretty complicated. For me personally, I feel pretty strongly that one of the reasons I like to read this kind of fiction, what I like to call comeuppance, I want to read a book about a person who commits a specific kind of violence, which is, related to things like serial killers. I want to see them get caught and pay for what they've done. So that's my personal reason for it, because this kind of violence, even though the statistics obviously on your average murder victim, as you say, 70-80% of murder victims are male, when you look at serial killer victims, right, it's very different. And I think that's a very specific kind of violence that women grow up worrying about and thinking about. And I think we want to confront those fears and see how it happens and understand why people who perpetrate that kind of violence do that. And then we also, I think, or at least I know I personally want to see them escape or the person get caught and pay for what they've done. And you'll notice in my books, I never go into the mind of the serial killers. I don't really particularly care about what's happening in their mind. Obviously, I want to understand why they're doing it, but I go into the mind of the victim from their perspective. I want them to be an agent in their own escape. Obviously, there's a murder victim or multiple murder victims. In general, the people that you meet that become perspective characters, I want to watch them be this sort of fierce survivor. So that's one of the things that I want to write about is survivor stories.
Well, and I think it goes deeper than that, too. Obviously, most women are reading this type of genre.
Yes.
So you have a bigger audience with women. And then as far as, unfortunately, white middle-aged women are the ones that people want to, like on Dateline. Those are the most popular episodes. It really is quite an interesting phenomenon.
It is. I'm actually writing a paper on this right now, sort of why do women read this? Why are we reading it? And why do we like to read about these kinds of murders? I think it's so complicated, I agree, because there's some sort of aspect, I think, of taboo. We learn about this when we're little, right? Don't walk by yourself, don't talk to strangers, be careful of men you don't know, because of this kind of specific violence. And then I think we want to understand it. And I think we're curious, and it's dark and taboo, and sort of what are the pieces of it? I don't know. I think it's fascinating.
It is. It really is.
We liked Kona, the dog. How old is the average cadaver dog when it's at its peak?
Most working dogs, search and rescue dogs, but all working dogs are usually trained from being a puppy, right? When they're born, they're usually selected from birth by a trainer who knows what they're doing and looks for certain qualities. For example, with a search and rescue dog, you need a dog that's going to be independent and a little bit more alpha. You can't have a really passive or skittish dog. But then you also need a dog that's extremely person-focused, right? They develop a relationship with their handler. So it's a hard balance to actually find a dog like that. That's independent, but also really loves their people. Usually they start as a puppy, and it depends on the dog because you need to get them out of that sort of puppy stage. But I would say usually around 3 to 5 years old is when most cadaver dogs and search and rescue dogs are at their peak.
Is there a certain breed that is better equipped for this than others?
Yeah, so there are definitely some breeds that are much more likely to be successful. And it's your typical working dog. So the dogs that you see doing all kinds of jobs, labs, golden retrievers, and then things like German shepherds. Hounds can be good, but sometimes they're a little too temperamental. But I have seen successful search and rescue dogs from all kinds of different breeds. You have a much higher chance of being successful with certain breeds, but I think almost any dog could be a successful search and rescue dog.
Now, was the Cave of Bones storyline based on a true event?
Not at all. It's just my own imagination. So there were a couple of murders along the sort of trail that runs through the Shenandoah National Park. That was sort of the loose inspiration was, if people went missing who were hiking solo, would they be missed? And how would they know where they disappeared? So that was a little bit of the inspiration, but the Cave of Bones was just my imagination.
You have a twisted mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, I consider that a compliment.
I do too.
Actually, my aunt and I went hiking the other day to this waterfall near my house. And when we got there, we were the only 2 people in the parking lot when we started to hike. I couldn't help it because I had finished your book and I was reading it thinking, oh my goodness. It was almost a little too real.
Sorry.
Looking over your shoulder.
But it does make you aware of your environment. That's for sure.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time, or I do still occasionally spend the time hiking solo. And so I often think, okay, if something happened to me, how long would it take anybody to figure out I was missing?
At dinner time, at least. They'd be like, where's dinner?
Right. Yeah, my son would certainly notice.
Yeah.
Well, you have a very diverse background. Archaeology, ancient religion, colonialism. Will any of these become part of your storylines in any future books?
For sure. I mean, I think all my interests are already, I throw everything I love into my books. When I actually came up with this series idea, I started off basically, it's a funny story. I was actually talking to my husband, and I'd been trying to come up with what I wanted to write. What did I want my book to be? And I had started maybe 20 or maybe more novels, and just nothing was hooking me. I was actually looking for something to read. I was scrolling online, looking at books, and I said to my husband, I wish somebody would just write a good thriller that included archaeology, neuroscience, and dogs, because those are my 3 passions. That was sort of the moment I was like, oh my God, well, of course, that's what I should write. I do try to include just all of the things that I love, including archaeology and ancient religion, in all of my books, because it's what I know the most about and because I just think it's endlessly fascinating. So yeah, I think all of the books in this series will certainly have some archaeological or ancient ritual component to them. I don't know, I might at some point send Sayer on a dig somewhere. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that.
Do you have a vision for how many books will be in the series, or just keep going?
I would love to just keep going. I have sort of the next, I think it's 8 books right now.
Wow.
Outline, I mean, very, very loosely outlined, but I have some major story arcs. So each book obviously is a self-contained mystery and will be solved. The case will be solved in each book, but I also wanted to have some larger sort of ongoing storylines.
You should definitely involve a fire in one
yes,
of the storylines.
I definitely will. Oh my gosh, yes.
Now, one of my favorite aspects of this story were interviews with subject 037. Please tell us they're going to be in future books.
For sure.
Oh, good.
I've actually finished Cut to the Bone is book 3 in the series. It's done now, and that'll be out next summer. So in that book, I really focus more on what actually happened to Jake, Sayer's fiance. So that sort of